Hello and welcome to a technical overview of the Deploy Expert suite. Deploy Expert is a deployment intelligence suite that helps you more effectively gain insight into your systems management environment by providing data-driven analytics and automation that makes the deployment of operating systems, drivers, firmware, and other software packages more manageable, more automated, and more effective. Deploy Expert technology gives you significant advantages in the efficient management and troubleshooting of Windows-based desktop and data center environments. So we're going to be taking a look at some features and of Deploy Expert and how it works. The first thing you're seeing here on the screen is the Altrinsic Management Console. So first, Deploy Expert Suite is a standalone console that integrates with a number of systems management platforms. The first step of our process is analysis, which really begins with inventory. We need to gather more data than generally the systems management provides by default so that we can act on that data and provide actionable data and inventory and analysis. So in this case, we're on a System Center 2012 environment. We've extended their default hardware inventory, and so we can gather information about the manufacturer model, so we can normalize that data. And additionally, we're gathering a lot of information about the devices on that system. Regular device IDs, compatible IDs, matching device IDs, date versions, driver dates, and even the status of these systems, manufacturer, and a lot of different information is being gathered from our inventory. When we have that data, we pull it into the Deploy Expert console, and then we do a classification, and that is basically where we are now in the platform analysis. So we're actually breaking this down first into model groups on the left here you see, but then even further into what we call classes. And so what we call classes are really discrete hardware platforms, in that each of these classes represents an exact device set of important devices. So, you may have several computers of the same model, but they could be in different classes because of chipset differences, video differences, and that sort of thing. So right off the bat, just with the inventory, Deploy Expert is giving you a lot of information about your environment that a lot of people don't have just by default. There's a lot of useful tools you can see here. You can see the devices, you can view statuses, and so if you have problems with a device right here, you can see this. Okay, on this HP TouchSmart, we're missing their drivers for this device for the touchscreen. Additionally, you can compare different classes or computers and see, okay, what two things are different between these two classes. And it'll highlight matching and non-matching devices between different classes, between different computers. And that can be really helpful too, because a lot of times people will get like a run of computers, and they'll discover that in the middle the manufacturer may have changed the chipset or something like that on them. And so this really helps them highlight the differences, and just having the information is really the first step for them to understand how to manage. Now we need to get drivers so that we can support these systems. So you select one and you go to Harvest Drivers, and you select your options and you do a Harvest Drivers. So this is actually, in this case, has created a software package program deployment, in this case in SCCM, but they all work the same on any management platform. Essentially, a program gets deployed to the client called drivermanager.exe. It gathers all of the drivers on the system, in this case not Microsoft drivers, you can see that checkbox, and sends them back to the server or a customized UNC path. Once they're all there and the job is completed successfully, we process the drivers and we add them into our component repository, which is basically our library where you can manage it. They are single sourced, so we do compare them as they come in, so we're not storing drivers more than once, and they're all stored together in one library. Once they're harvested, that generally, depending on how the management platform, of course, depends on how long before the client starts, but once the client is running, it usually only takes between 30 seconds and 2 minutes to complete the harvest, and you'll have drivers going. So that is important. In the platform analysis, the classes begin to turn green. So in this case, you can see I've got a couple harvested classes and a couple non-harvested classes. The red ones are non-harvested. If you have a bunch of classes, this green bubble will turn partially green. And so that way they can see how far along they are in gathering the drivers they need to support their environment. If we go to the component repository, we can manage the drivers that have come in. So there's a lot of things in this interface, but what we're seeing in the top left is the list of all the drivers for this profile. Over here are the details of the selected driver. In the bottom are the classes. And then down in the bottom right are the associated drivers. So you can manage these in a lot of different ways. You can be very fine-tuning. You could literally just uncheck a driver and save for a single class. But you can also do with more broad strokes. You could delete a driver entirely. You could remove it from a model or add it to a model, or you can even associate to an entire profile. And when I say profile, in DX we call profiles basically their OS initiatives. So you keep your drivers for Windows 7 different from your Windows 8 drivers, of course, and your Windows XP drivers. And so we just use the word profile to make that simple on the end user. But essentially it's just showing you the drivers that have been harvested, the applications and the downloaded drivers all together here. Now, we manage them all together. Harvested drivers come in from the harvest, as you imagine. You can add third-party drivers just by hitting Add Component. Like if you have the driver files, you can just browse to them and hit OK and give it a name and import it in, and then you can manage it on your own that way. Applications can also be added in a couple different ways. Again, if you just have the application, you can add it in from this interface just by browsing to the setup.exe and giving it a name. If you have them in a systems management platform like Configuration Manager, you could also import them in from there. And the final way that you can get applications, and this I'll stress works currently with Dell FTP, but essentially this will pull these down from the Dell FTP. Can grab drivers and applications from Dell. So you can see it just basically pulls up a list of the drivers, tells you which ones you already have, and so if you're missing things, you can just download them directly. Now, the benefit of having this on top of the harvest is that some devices benefit from having the software or require the software to do anything useful. In Dell's, the Control Vault software is very much like that, but in other cases, fingerprint readers, other biometrics, sometimes Bluetooth devices, they need software to install or be used, efficiently. So you can just do this, and you can choose basically any of these as you wish. You hit apply, and it'll begin downloading this to your repository. And there's a little status bar. So again, that works for Dells, but it's a very handy tool whenever you need those applications to go along with a driver file. So those are the few ways that really you build your library of drivers. But the point here is we're talking about where we've done the analysis, we know what's in our environment, now we need to support what's in our environment by getting the drivers. So the harvest is the main way, but there are other ways that you can add in manually or download other drivers into the Deploy Expert suite. Now, if we're talking about OS deployments, obviously each management platform works a little bit different. In this case, we integrate into an existing task sequence just by choosing an appropriate task sequence, choosing our model or class based, and then adding it into a profile. And then basically we will integrate into a task sequence to make it a hardware independent task sequence. But no matter what the management platform is, they all work basically the same. Essentially what's happening is that we do a small inventory on the client as it's running an automation. Essentially, we usually call it a metadata. So we gather a little bit of information so we can identify, is this a known system? If it's not a known system, we gather information about the model so we can build a model driver pack. And so we're basically gathering that information so that we can give it the best set of drivers that we can. So we gather the information, a request gets sent back, and then we dynamically generate a list of drivers for that system specifically. So in all the management platforms, they're always dynamically done. We're not building driver packages or building fat images or anything like that. We're dynamically saying, okay, here's the list of drivers, download these to the client, and then when it reboots, they'll get installed either through a bat file or through sysprep, can install those drivers and apps when it comes back up, depending on the management platform. But essentially, that's how our OSD is working on any of the management platforms. So if you can integrate into and in all the management platforms, we do we use the image deploying capabilities of the management platform itself. DX is really just geared towards deploying the drivers and applications that have been associated with that system to make it a hardware independent image deployment essentially. So those are that's the portion of using the drivers for OSD, but the other piece is that you can also use this driver library that you've built to just send out to drivers in that are just sitting in production. So if we go here we see the system analytics view of Device Expert. So what I'm going to show you here is how Deploy Expert helps you to more intelligently manage firmware and drivers by giving you informed data-driven analytics that allow you to update and roll back and standardize the drivers in any environment. So because Deploy Expert is normalizing the view of your environment, it allows you to see and understand key system differences so that you can isolate the common thread problems in the whole environment. So essentially, when you choose from your model tree, I've chosen a whole manufacturer here, but you can do this by model, by class, however you'd like. I don't have a lot of these Dells here specifically, but you can choose anything in the model tree, and you can start with the device. So in this wizard, we start, okay, I choose my Dell system, I choose my device, and then I move to the next step of deploying the driver. And you can see, of course, which computers that applies to. If you don't have the driver, you can harvest the driver from here, but a lot of times they'll have the repository already built and they'll have the driver set up here. Either way, that takes them to component deployment, where you can choose a driver from this list, or the driver you chose in the last interface will be highlighted, and it'll basically show you which systems are compatible with the driver. So in this case, I believe I just have one system, my E6500, that is compatible with this driver. You can see drivers that are compatible with the system that show the drivers that without the selected driver version, or show systems with it. Now in this case, I only have one computer, so I actually don't have any systems with this driver installed, so it's blank. But you can choose this, and you can choose manufacturer level, model level, or even down. You could choose a single computer or a single two computers. But essentially, we're selecting the target that we want to deploy this driver to. And you can, in fact, go through this list and shift select and see different, so you can make an entire driver pack as well. And basically what we do next is we select the driver we want to deploy. We create what we call a deployment policy. Give it a name, and then go back through here. You can do a force reinstall. This comes in handy when you're doing a rollback. You also have to choose your reboot options, whether you want it to reboot required, request a reboot, and essentially all that. And then when you enable the deployment policy, but essentially we call it a policy in Deploy Expert, but essentially in SCCM at least, it's actually a software package program that's being deployed out through the selected target system. So usually we recommend people set up a deployment policy for maybe one or two target computers, test it out, and then you can come back in here and add more target computers or add more drivers to this policy and re-enable it. But essentially, this is how you take the driver files that you've harvested and send them out to systems in production. And then the final piece is what we call our deploy applications. So the first of those wizards we show, were basically drivers. We have the analytics, we have the matching device IDs because we harvested those information, so we have a lot of information to work with. And you can see, from those wizards, you can see device errors and things like that, and can really target. Well, let me jump back here. You can really target. By looking through this list, you can see, okay, I have a lot of instances of this driver, or this device appears a lot, and it actually has a lot of errors. So you can really highlight a lot of problems just by sorting these columns, and you can say, okay, I didn't realize I had so many different versions of this chipset, and oh look, 3 or 4 of them have errors, or 10 of them have errors, and so you can really, cut off problems before you have them, just by having the information provided about the harvested drivers. But back to application. So the applications interface here basically is a way to create customized filters. One of the problems with chipset and firmware, like firmware and other applications like that, is that they really have a lot of specific criteria, and this can involve, obviously the right OS, but also if files are present, register keys, WMI queries. A lot of things are required for a lot of different BIOS and firmware applications to install properly. So in this case, if we want to install one of these drivers, let's create a new one. And we're basically going to create a set of criteria for this driver. So we can start, say, OS. That makes sense. Let's say it's for my Windows 64-bit, and we can add this criteria. Then we can additionally say, okay, I also have a registry key that needs to be checked in HKey local machine. And I have just one example copied there, so we'll add in the registry key as well. For Configuration Manager, you can also do a collection. If you're familiar with this, these are basically, a lot of users already have these configured, so you can say, okay, also look in a specific collection and add that criteria. And you can, of course, move these up and down because of the way they can be nested within each other. So there's actually a lot of tools here and a lot of power to nest and make conditional conditions based on one thing or another. So if this file exists, well, then go ahead and check another file and that sort of thing. And so you can indent these and arrange them in the correct order that you want. But essentially, all you're trying to get to is, oops. There we go, is to create a filter like this. Now these filters, just by the way, are you can import and export them. So these are even shareable between, if someone has done a lot of work for a specific Dell firmware and they've set up a lot of criteria, not everyone has to remake them. They could get it from someone else. But essentially when you've built it, you go to create a, before I mention that, sometimes people will have this already set up as an application in their management platform. So you can also import apps from there. Or as a software package and install them in. But essentially we're going to create a deployment policy, and again, this is similar to the driver deployment policies, but this is an application deployment policy. Essentially, it will show you the model tree that are compatible with the application and the criteria you set up, and then it will, when you enable the policy, it's an application this time that gets sent out. Now, some of these criteria are checked immediately right here against this model tree. So like if I say, the OS has to contain Windows 7 64, you're only going to be able to select Windows 7 64-bit systems. Some of the criteria have to be checked client-side and will happen after the deployment policy is enabled. And so that occurs for things like, does a file exist? Obviously DX doesn't have that information on hand, so that gets checked after the policy is enabled. Before the drivers try to get installed, it will actually check and make sure that the criteria is fit for all those things. And that, again, is actually done by the driver manager.exe, which is the same executable that does the harvest. So between the driver deployments and the application deployments, we really give you a lot of power to influence your environment. And so really you can see the problems and you really have the tools to fix them. And so really with Device Expert and Deploy Expert, you kind of get a full driver suite. So thank you for watching this technical video on Deploy Expert.